Hello. As we continue on our study for David, we're learning that his life is a lot like ours, and he faces a time in his life when some lessons are just really hard to learn. You ever go through that? You keep on having to learn the same lessons over and over. We're going to start with chapter 26 of 1 Samuel and go all the way through 29. So we're going to sort of breeze through this. And chapter 26 is a contrast between men who set God before them and men who don't. We can look at chapter 26 as being same song, second verse. It's almost like chapter 24, 1 Samuel, except the location is different. We're on a hillside now and not a cave. And the objects that David takes are different. First time it was a robe. Today it's going to be a jug of water and a spear. But the actions are the same. The intent is the same. But yet, there's a lot to learn in this. And it even starts out when you think about the song, you think of the same song, you think about the chorus being the same. And that's exactly what we see here. In chapter 6, the first few verses talk about how the Ziphites, again, those people who had betrayed David several chapters ago when he was running around the mountain and being chased by Saul, find out that David's back in the land, and they again make that 30-mile march to Gibeah to let Saul know, hey, David's hiding in our hills. Come and get him. He's out in the wilderness. So Saul selects 3,000 of the most elite forces he could find in Israel and takes off for David and his little band of 600 men. You know, what would you do if you were David? You have given the best you have to these people, to Israel. Even to the Ziphites, he had not done any wrong. You've given the best you have to the king. And yet, it seems like they turn against you. Do you give up? Do you just say, what's the use? Let them take care of it? Well, David might have done that later, but right now, he's pushing through. He's still trying to do good. And although Paul was not around to write the words of 1 Corinthians 15:58, therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, not knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Saying, do not give up, David. Keep on pushing through. Keep on pushing through. Remember, God is going to judge you and he's going to judge them, and it's what you do for him that counts. Just keep going. Paul also wrote in Galatians 6:8 and 9, for he who sows to the flesh will reap of the flesh corruptions. David, that's Saul. That's what he's going to reap. But he who reaps of the Spirit will reap of the Spirit, who sows to the Spirit will reap of the Spirit everlasting life. David, that's you. That's you. And so don't be weary in well-doing, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up, if we don't lose heart. That was a word for David, a word that he needed. And he was remembering it now, but as we're going to see today, these are words he would soon forget or at least put on the back burner for a while. David knew the men were there, and so he sent out spies to see if that was true. And they came back and said, yep, Saul's here. David decided that he was going to go into the camp that night, and he asked for volunteers to go with him. He asked for a couple, and Abishai, who is the brother of that bloodthirsty Joab, decided, hey, I'll go with you. I'll go with you. And so in verses 7 through 12, we see David going into the camp and how that he again spares Saul's life on a hillside in the cover of night. Along with Abishai, David creeps into the camp, and they secretly visit this camp. These two men against 3,000 men. Now, God has put a deep slumber and sleep on these men. Nothing would wake them up. But David didn't know that when he set out on his journey. God had placed him in a deep sleep, perhaps because he wanted to look into David's heart, to see if he was still a man who would follow after him, or if he had become a man like Saul who would take things into his own hands and just do what he wanted to do rather than listen. And truly, this was a character-defining moment for David. David again had the opportunity to decide, am I going to live by the honor principle? Am I going to recognize that authority that God has placed over me, recognizing that all authority is established by him? Or do I just do what I want to do? When they got inside the camp, David had that opportunity right off. There was Saul, sound asleep. His spear, his water jug, laying right beside his head. They didn't have to look for a weapon. They didn't have to do anything. There it was. The spear was stuck up in the ground. All they had to do was reach and take it, and they could get rid of Saul. As a matter of fact, that's what Abishai offered to do. He stood over the king and he begged him to let him kill him. Now, Abishai had been with David in that cave when David cut off Saul's robe. And he had also heard David say, do not touch God's anointed. Let him go. Abishai had been one of the men who watched Saul walk out of that cave under David's protection. But here he was saying, God has surely handed your enemies over to you this time. And why do you think God would put him under such a sound sleep if he didn't want you to go ahead and take care of him right now and move into your destiny? Give me that spear. Let me strike him one time. I'll put it right through his head to the ground, and I won't have to strike him again. It would have been easy for David to think, maybe this time God really is giving me the opportunity, giving me the go-ahead to take my place. Maybe he realizes that Saul is not just a bad man. He's bad for the country. He's bad for the nation of Israel. And look at all he's done for me. He's tried to kill me over and over. He's taken everything I have. He's even given my wife to another man. But finally, David spoke up and said, no, do not kill him. For who can stand against the Lord's anointed and stretch out their hand, attacking him and still be innocent? David then gave possible ways that God might move in and take care of it for them. Perhaps God might strike him himself, the same way that he had got rid of Nabal. Maybe Saul would just die of natural causes. Or perhaps one day he would go in battle, and during the battle, Saul would die. Whatever it was, David was in charge of the situation at this moment, and he refused to let Abishai take over. He was going to trust God. However, David was having another one of his human moments and letting his human character take over, and he wanted Saul to know he had been there. So he goes over and, he says to Abishai, get me the spear and get me the water, and then let's get out of here. What was David doing again? The same thing he did back in the cave of Adullam, only it wasn't a robe, but this time it was the spear, which represented Saul's authority. He said, give me the spear, which represents his authority, and give me the water, which out in the desert as they were, out in the wilderness as they were, you could not live without water. Give me the water that represents his life. So David again symbolically took Saul's authority and his life even though he left his person there untouched. And David never acknowledged this wrong to anyone. Instead, he goes out on the hillside and he calls to Abner. And when he calls to Abner, he gets far away and he wants to embarrass him in front of everyone. And he says, Abner, aren't you a man? Aren't you supposed to be a valiant man? And what have you done? Letting your king fall into the hands of one who could have taken his life? See, I have his spear and I have his water jug here. David was heaping contempt upon Saul's general who had slept through everything. And more than that, David was rebuking Abner for not protecting the man who was trying to kill him. David said, he wants to kill me, you should have protected him. It makes no sense to us, but David knew that it was a right thing to do, because in David's eyes, Israel was God's chosen nation. And because Israel was God's chosen nation, Saul had been chosen to rule this nation, and Abner, as his commander, was placed in a position that he should have protected the king. And because he did not protect the king, he had failed miserably, and he was worthy of death. David chastised Abner strongly and said that he was not a just man, but he was worthy of death because of what he had done. He said, why did you fail? You have committed a crime worthy of death by falling asleep on the job. That's what Abner did. Abner never admitted that he was wrong, though. Abner was so upset and obsessed with David. The only thing he did was say, what right do you have to question us? And usually people who are wrong, people who are scornful, they may even be godly people, but what they say and what they do will bring out their character, and they will usually reveal their heart. And so David, even though he was wrong, Abner was trying to justify himself just as much. So then Saul steps into the picture. Saul recognized the voice of David, and he says, oh, is this my son David? He knew who he was, whether Abner recognized him or would admit it or not. And so again, David confronted Saul with his well-thought-out plan. And he wanted to know two things. He wanted to know why Saul was pursuing him, and he wanted to know what evil he had done. And he says, if God sees that I have committed a sin, let me know. I will confess and I will take an offering to God. But if men like Abner have caused all this problem, even the women seen, he said, well, then let God's wrath fall on them. And who are you, the king, out to catch me when I'm nothing more than a flea or a bird? Saul heard these words, and again his heart was stirred. And he said, return, my son David, for I will harm you no more, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. I have played the fool and erred exceedingly. Saul tried to reestablish friendships with David through saying this. He confessed his sin without blaming anyone or even explaining why he was chasing David for that matter. But he did promise that he wouldn't harm David anymore. So he made that confession. He repented. And how did David respond? Well, he acknowledged Saul's repentance by saying that God should repay every man according to what they had done. And he said that Saul, you were delivered in my hand. God delivered you, the king, into my hand, but I would not harm you. And I recognize that you are God's anointed, and your life is valuable. And because your life is valuable, God will deliver you out of all of this. And because of that, I'm asking that you will deliver me as well. And his confession shows two reasons why he wouldn't kill the king. One, because he was anointed, and two, because David knew whatever he sowed, he was going to reap. Remember that scripture in Galatians? This shows that he still had God's character, that he was a man after his own heart who thought like God thinks. So, at the end of this, David and Saul part for a final time. Saul says, "May you be blessed, my son, for you will both do great things, and you shall also prevail." Saul gives a final acknowledgement of David being the future king and puts a blessing on him. David wisely takes his men away, goes back into the wilderness. He recognizes that Saul may have said this, but I really don't trust him. And that's a great lesson for us. Just because someone says the words, just because someone sheds some tears, does not mean their heart is really right with God. But even in doing this, you see, he neither accepted Saul's confession, and neither did he repent of his own actions toward his behavior in taking the spear and the jug of wine. So his character took a major hit, and he's getting ready for a fall. He's getting ready to fall away from his destiny and away from God. The saddest thing that we see about Saul's actions toward David is how it caused him to run away to the enemies of God and to Israel's enemies. And that's where we find David in the next chapter. In chapter 27, David said in his heart, "I shall perish someday by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than I should speedily escape to the land of the Philistines, for then Saul will despair of me and stop hunting me." And so David took 600 of his men, along with their families, and went to Gath. He had just heard Saul's blessing, but he knew that Saul was a liar. He knew that he could not trust him. And so he goes back to the land of the Philistines, back to Gath, back to Israel's enemies, back to the people who did not worship God. He could have just as easily have gone to Moab and not been involved in any fighting or anything. He could have stayed with his family, but instead he took the road back to Gath. And while there, we see one of the darkest periods of David's life. And verses 5 through 12 of chapter 27, David is there. He's been there with Achish, the king of Gath, probably for a month or two. The last time he was there in chapter 21, the men of Gath didn't want to see him. They all said, "Oh, this is David. He's slaying tens of thousands." But by now, the years of running from Saul in the wilderness, it has changed their mind and their thoughts toward David. So this time he finds favor. He's been with Achish in the royal city of Gath for probably a month or two. 600 men, their families, that's a lot to pull into a town. And so David said, "Oh, King Achish, I'm not worthy to live in this royal city with you, the king. Give me a small town somewhere so I can take my men and families and we can live in peace." And so Achish assigned to him the city of Ziklag. David and his men and their families moved there. And they're there for 16 months. During that time, though, they don't just quietly sit by and learn how to be farmers. They have to make a living. And they do that by going on raids. Only what they do is they go on raids to the Canaanite cities. They go out to raids the Gershites, the Gerzites, and the Amalekites, those nations that had been inhabitants of the land way back when Joshua came into the picture and told the children of Israel, you're to go in and you're to destroy all of these nations. Everybody that lives, you're to get rid of them. David was fulfilling that. The problem was he didn't tell Achish the truth. The king would say, oh, David, where have you been today? And David would say, oh, I have been out among all the lands of Judah or of some other place in Israel, and I have destroyed all their cities. Because you see, David never left a survivor to tell any difference. And Achish believed him. For the second time, David is in Gath, and he's again using deception. And he does that, and Achish believes him. And so after a year and 4 months, when the Israelites are now getting ready to face their major battle with the Philistines, Achish calls David in. Says, David, all the Philistines are getting together. All of our nations are coming together. And I want you to join with me. I want you to fight with me. And David says, surely you know what your servant will do. David's a man of deception by this time. He's a master deceiver. And by saying that, he neither committed to the Philistines, nor did he commit against Israel. But Achish, who believed him, heard what he wanted to hear. And he said, oh, I knew I could count on you, and I'm going to make you a chief of all my military. He says, I am going to give you a very high position. David was set. All of the armies came together, the Philistines. They came together to do battle. This was going to be that final battle that Saul would participate in, that battle where Saul would die. And as all of the armies were marching out and on display, the other Philistine kings saw David. Said, what is he doing here? Achish said, he's my leader. The other Philistines would have nothing against it. And over Achish's objections, David was pulled out. David objected too. We don't know, was he really going to fight for Israel, or was he really going to fight for the Philistines? That story is unfinished, and we don't know what would have happened in the battle. The only thing we do know is that Israel eventually lost and Saul died. And as a result of that, David returned to his home in Ziklag. And it was this place, what happened there in Ziklag, that became the catalyst for David turning back to God, for putting David back on his road to his destiny. Next week, next session, we will finish up this session, this season, on our study in David as we see him approach his destiny.